Dean Martin left behind a fortune that divided his family forever. The Christmas that changed everything. On Christmas Day, 1995, Dean Martin died alone in his Beverly Hills home. He was 78 years old. The man who had spent decades making the world laugh, who had defined cool for an entire generation, spent his final morning with only a housekeeper by his side. But when his 8 children gathered to settle his estate, they discovered something that would shock them far more than his solitary death. Their father had left behind a fortune worth over $30 million, and he had divided it in a way that would tear his family apart forever. The reading of Dean Martin's will wasn't just a legal formality, it was a revelation. Because Dean hadn't simply split his wealth equally among his children. He had created a complex trust system that gave vastly different amounts to different children, assigned control to some while excluding others, and made crystal clear through cold legal language exactly how he had felt about each of them. Some children walked away with millions and power over his legacy. Others received far less, with conditions attached. And one simple truth became impossible to ignore. Dean Martin had been keeping score all along. But here's what made it truly devastating. The children who received the least weren't surprised by their father's distance. They had lived with it their entire lives. The children who received the most weren't surprised either. They had earned it through years of persistence, of showing up when he pushed them away, of never giving up on a man who seemed determined to be alone. No, the devastating part wasn't the surprise. It was the confirmation. The will confirmed what they had all suspected, but never wanted to believe, that their father had loved them differently, valued them differently, and planned for their futures differently, based on relationships that were never equal to begin with. To understand why Dean Martin structured his fortune the way he did, why he chose to divide his family rather than unite them, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to his childhood in Steubenville, Ohio, though that matters. Not to his rise to fame with Jerry Lewis, or his reign as King of Cool with the Rack Pack, though those years defined him. No, we need to understand something more fundamental. Dean Martin didn't have one family. He had 3. 3 wives, 8 children, and decades of complicated, fractured relationships that money couldn't fix, but that money would ultimately expose for exactly what they were. This is the story of a fortune that divided a family, but more than that, it's the story of why Dean Martin wanted it that way. Chapter 1. 3 wives, 8 children, one impossible family. Dean Martin wasn't just married 3 times. He built 3 separate families, raised children who barely knew each other existed, and created a web of relationships so complex that even he couldn't navigate it without causing pain. His first marriage was to Betty McDonald in 1941, back when he was still Dino Jr, a struggling nightclub singer who could barely pay rent. Betty believed in him when no one else did. She supported him through the lean years, the constant rejection, the nights when he came home with empty pockets and big dreams. Together they had 4 children, Craig in 1942, Claudia in 1944, Gail in 1945, and Deana in 1948. But as Dean's career began to take off, as his partnership with Jerry Lewis turned them into the hottest act in America, something shifted. Betty watched her husband transform from Dino, the man she married, into Dean Martin, the star everyone wanted. And Dean Martin didn't have time for a wife and 4 young children. The marriage ended in 1949, right as Dean was becoming famous. Betty struggled to make ends meet in a modest Los Angeles apartment, while her ex-husband performed for thousands and earned more in a week than she'd see in a year. For Craig, Claudia, Gail, and Deana, childhood meant weekend visits to a father who seemed like a stranger. They'd arrive at his new, bigger houses, meet his new, more glamorous friends, and feel like visitors in a life that had moved on without them. Craig, the eldest, later remembered waiting hours for his father to come home from rehearsals, only to be told he'd gone straight to another meeting. Claudia stopped asking to visit by the time she was 13. Gail kept trying, but always felt like she was scheduling appointments, not spending time with her dad. Only Deana, the youngest of the first four, refused to give up. She would show up unannounced, call repeatedly, and make herself impossible to ignore. It was exhausting and often painful, but she never stopped trying. Meanwhile, Dean had moved on. In 1949, the same year his divorce from Betty was finalized, he married Jeannie Beeger. This marriage lasted 24 years, Dean's entire golden era. With Jean, he had 3 more children: Dean Paul, born in 1951, who everyone called Dino Jr., Richie, born in 1953, and Gina, born in 1956. These children grew up in Beverly Hills mansions. They attended Hollywood parties where Frank Sinatra was just Uncle Frank, and Sammy Davis Jr. made them laugh at family dinners. They watched their father tape television shows, record hit albums, and build an entertainment empire. But they also watched him work constantly, drink heavily, or at least pretend to for the cameras, and maintain an emotional distance that felt impossible to bridge. Dino Jr. tried the hardest, following his father into entertainment, becoming a performer himself, desperately seeking approval that Dean rarely gave directly. Richie and Gina learned early to not expect too much, to appreciate the lifestyle, but not expect the emotional intimacy that other families seem to have. Dean's second marriage ended in 1973. He was 56 years old, exhausted from decades of performing, and struggling with the reality that his children from both marriages barely knew each other and barely knew him. But Dean Martin couldn't seem to be alone. Within months, he married Catherine Hahn, a woman 24 years younger who worked as a receptionist. Catherine had a daughter named Sasha from a previous relationship, and Dean legally adopted her. For 3 years, Dean tried to make it work, but the marriage was doomed from the start. When it ended in 1976, Dean made one decision that surprised everyone. He kept Sasha in his life. She remained his legal daughter, part of his family, though her connection to the Martin clan was the most tenuous of all. By the time Dean Martin reached his final decade, he had 8 children, ranging from their 50s to their 20s. Some remembered him as an absent father who chose fame over family. Some remembered him as a distant provider who gave them everything except himself. One remembered him as an aging man who adopted her briefly before disappearing into his own loneliness. They had different mothers, different childhoods, different relationships with the man they all called father. And as they would discover after his death, Dean had assigned them different values as well. Chapter 2. The fortune built while fatherhood failed. While Dean Martin's children were growing up without him, while they were learning to accept his absence as normal, Dean was building something extraordinary. Not just a career, but an empire. A financial legacy so sophisticated, so carefully structured, that it would take lawyers years to fully unpack it. And every smart business decision he made, every clever investment that would eventually benefit his children, came at the cost of time he didn't spend with them. The 1950s and 60s were Dean's workaholic years. He and Jerry Lewis made 16 films in 7 years, an impossible pace that left no room for family dinners or children's birthdays. When that partnership ended bitterly in 1956, Dean didn't slow down. He doubled down. He joined the Rat Pack and began performing in Las Vegas, shows that started at 10 p.m. and didn't end until 3 in the morning. He'd sleep until noon, play golf, then return to the stage. His weekends were residencies at casino showrooms. His weekdays were film shoots or television tapings. There were recording sessions for albums, press appearances, and business meetings that stretched late into the night. His first 4 children, living with Betty, rarely saw him. They'd visit every other weekend if he was in town, which he often wasn't. Craig later described the experience as visiting a hotel guest, not a father. They'd knock on the door of whatever house Dean was living in at the time, be greeted by staff, and wait in living rooms that smelled expensive and felt cold. Sometimes Dean would appear, distracted and checking his watch. Sometimes he wouldn't appear at all, sending apologies through his assistant about an unexpected obligation. The children learned not to expect reliability. They learned to not expect much at all. His second set of children, living with him in the Beverly Hills mansion during his marriage to Jeannie, had a different experience, but ultimately the same result. They saw him more often, but they didn't know him better. Dino Jr. remembered countless mornings eating breakfast across from a father who read the newspaper in silence. Ricci recalled how Dean would come home from Las Vegas, sleep for a day, then disappear again to the golf course. Gina, the youngest of this group, simply accepted that fathers were more like friendly uncles who occasionally appeared, charming, funny, but ultimately unknowable. But here's what none of them understood at the time. While Dean seemed to be playing golf and living the carefree life his public persona suggested, he was actually conducting business. Those golf games? They were with real estate developers and casino executives. Those long absences? Many of them were meetings with attorneys and financial advisors. Dean Martin was building wealth with the same intensity he brought to performing, but he did it so quietly that even his own children had no idea. In the 1960s, when most television stars were simply employees of networks, Dean formed his own production company, Claude Productions, named after his real last name, Crocetti. He negotiated to own his shows, not just appear on them. It seemed like an unnecessary complication to industry insiders, but Dean understood something they didn't. Ownership meant perpetual income. Every time the Dean Martin show aired, was syndicated, or was eventually sold on DVD or streaming platforms, the money would flow to him, and eventually to his heirs, not to NBC. Similarly, Dean approached his Las Vegas performances differently than other stars. While Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. demanded enormous guaranteed fees, money they'd spend as quickly as they earned it, Dean negotiated for smaller guarantees plus ownership stakes in the casinos themselves. People thought he was being taken advantage of, accepting less money up front. They didn't realize he was acquiring equity positions that would multiply in value as Las Vegas transformed from a gambling outpost to a global entertainment destination. Those fractional ownership stakes, purchased for thousands in the 1960s, would eventually be bought out for millions when corporate consolidation hit Las Vegas in the 80s and 90s. The same strategic thinking applied to his music rights. Dean systematically built ownership of his recordings, his publishing rights, even specific arrangements of his most famous songs. While other performers of his era focused on record sales and performance fees, Dean was playing a longer game, building a catalog that would generate income long after he stopped performing. His children saw none of this. They saw a father who chose golf over their school plays, who missed holidays because of performance schedules, who seemed to care more about his career than his family. And they weren't wrong, exactly. Dean did prioritize his work. But what looked like selfishness or emotional distance was also, in his mind, the greatest gift he could give them. He was building security. He was ensuring that his children and grandchildren would never struggle the way he had as a young man in Steubenville, never face the uncertainty and poverty that had defined his early life. The tragedy, and Dean Martin's life was full of small tragedies that would culminate in one enormous one, was that he never explained this to them. He never sat his children down and said, "I'm absent because I'm building your future." He just stayed absent, and they just felt abandoned. The fortune was growing, but so was the distance. Chapter 3. March 21st, 1987. The day everything ended. If you had to choose one moment when Dean Martin stopped being Dean Martin, when the light went out behind his eyes and never fully returned, it would be March 21st, 1987. That was the day his son, Dean Paul Martin's military jet crashed into a California mountain during a routine training mission. Dino Jr. was 35 years old, and for Dean, losing him meant losing the one child he'd truly connected with, the one who'd followed in his footsteps, the one who'd somehow forgiven all the absences and disappointments and loved him anyway. Dean Paul Martin was the golden child, though Dean would never have used those words. Dino Jr. had his father's looks, the same dark hair, the same easy smile that could light up a room. He had his father's natural charisma, the ability to walk into any situation and make people feel comfortable. And unlike Dean's other children, Dino Jr. had actively pursued entertainment. He'd formed a rock band with Desi Arnaz Jr. and a friend, calling themselves Dino, Desi, and Billy. They'd actually had hits in the mid-60s, performing on television and touring. Later, Dino Jr. transitioned to acting, appearing on TV shows and working to build his own career. But he was also an Air National Guard pilot, serving his country while maintaining his entertainment career. On paper, Dean had 7 other children, but Dino Jr. was the one he talked about with pride, the one whose calls he always took, the one who could make him laugh even in his darker moods. If any of Dean's children had a real relationship with him, it was Dino Jr. And now he was gone, killed instantly when his F-4 Phantom fighter jet disappeared from radar during what should have been a routine training flight over the San Gorgonio wilderness. Dean was on tour when it happened, the Together Again tour with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., a reunion of the Rat Pack, the final victory lap for 3 aging legends. Dean got the news from his manager just hours before showtime at the Golden Nugget in Las Vegas. His son was missing. Search teams were looking, but the mountain terrain was unforgiving. Dean stood in his dressing room, staring at nothing. And then he did something that would haunt his other children forever. He went on stage. He performed the entire show, every song, every joke, every carefully choreographed moment with Frank and Sammy. The audience had no idea. They saw Dean Martin, cool, relaxed, a drink in his hand and a smile on his face. They didn't see a father whose world had just ended. When the show finished and the curtain came down, Dean collapsed. Not physically, he didn't fall or faint, but something inside him simply stopped working. His manager found him sitting on the floor of his dressing room, still in his tuxedo, staring at the wall. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stared. The next day, search teams found the crash site. There were no survivors. Dean quit the tour immediately, walking away from millions in guaranteed income. Frank and Sammy tried to continue without him, but it felt wrong. The tour collapsed. Dean returned to his Beverly Hills home and refused to leave for weeks. His children tried to rally around him. Deana flew in from wherever she was and camped out at the house, determined to be there for her father, even if he wouldn't acknowledge her presence. Craig called repeatedly but could never get past the housekeeper. Jean, his second wife and Dino Jr.'s mother, was drowning in her own grief and couldn't bear to see Dean. The other children, Claudia, Gail, Ricci, Gina, Sasha, didn't know what to do. Some tried to visit and were turned away. Some sent flowers and never received acknowledgement. Some stopped trying after a few attempts. What none of them fully understood at the time was that Dean blamed himself. Not rationally, there was nothing he could have done to prevent a military training accident, but emotionally, devastatingly, he blamed himself for all of it. For encouraging Dino Jr. to pursue entertainment, keeping him in the public eye and under pressure to live up to the Martin name, for not being present enough in his son's childhood, for all the missed moments they could never get back, for outliving his child, which felt like a violation of the natural order so profound that Dean couldn't process it. In the 8 years between Dino Jr.'s death and his own, Dean Martin became a ghost. He stopped performing. He stopped recording. He stopped appearing in public unless absolutely necessary. He spent his days in his bedroom, watching old Western movies, smoking, barely eating. His housekeeper became his gatekeeper, turning away visitors and making excuses. Some of his children persisted, Deana especially, calling every day, showing up weekly, refusing to let her father disappear completely. Others gave up after months of rejection, deciding that if Dean Martin wanted to be alone, they would respect that choice, even if it hurt. But here's what none of them knew. In those 8 years of isolation, Dean Martin was making decisions about his fortune, about his legacy, and about each of his children. He was reviewing his life, measuring relationships, and planning how to divide an empire in a way that would reflect the truth of those relationships, not some comfortable fantasy of familial love. The will he was creating would reveal everything, and it would change everything. Chapter 4. The Will That Exposed Everything. January 1996. A month after Dean Martin's death, 8 children gathered in a Beverly Hills law office for the official reading of their father's will. Some brought spouses for support. Some came alone, maintaining the emotional distance that had defined their relationships with each other for decades. They sat in expensive leather chairs in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Los Angeles, and they waited to learn what their father had left them. They expected a standard estate distribution, maybe not perfectly equal. Some of them had maintained closer relationships with Dean than others, and they understood there might be some variation. But they expected fairness. They expected their father, even in death, to try to bring them together rather than push them apart. They were wrong on every count. The attorney began with the overview. The estate was valued at approximately $30 million, though the final accounting would take months to complete. There was real estate, the Beverly Hills home, properties in Palm Springs, investment holdings across the Southwest. There was the television and music catalog, worth millions in perpetual royalties. There was the Las Vegas casino equity, accumulated over decades of strategic negotiations. There was an investment portfolio of blue-chip stocks that Dean had held for years. And there was intellectual property, trademarks, image rights, licensing agreements that would continue generating income long after his death. Then the attorney explained the distribution, and the room went silent. Dean Martin hadn't created a simple will. He'd created the Dean Martin Family Trust, a complex legal structure with different tiers, different allocations, and different levels of control for different children. Some children received direct cash distributions, one-time payments that would fulfill their inheritance but give them no ongoing involvement in the estate. Others received trust funds that would pay out over time, with conditions attached. And one child received something that looked less like an inheritance and more like a promotion: control over the legacy itself. Deana Martin, the youngest of the first 4 children, the one who'd never stopped calling, never stopped visiting, never stopped trying to connect with her father even when he pushed her away. Deana received the largest single share. More than that, she was named co-executor of the estate, along with the attorney. She was given control over Dean Martin's image rights, the final say on licensing deals and media appearances, the power to approve or reject any commercial use of her father's name and likeness. Deana didn't just inherit money. She inherited the kingdom. The children from Dean's second marriage, Richie and Gina, received substantial trusts that would pay them for life. Not controlling shares, but comfortable ones. Enough to live well, to benefit from their father's success, but not enough to challenge Deana's authority over how Dean Martin would be remembered. The first three children from Dean's first marriage, Craig, Claudia, and Gail, received equal shares that were noticeably smaller than their younger sisters. Direct distributions rather than perpetual trusts. Their inheritances were generous by normal standards, millions of dollars that would change their lives. But compared to Deana's, compared to the message being sent, they were being told, in legal language as cold as their father's emotional distance had been, that they mattered less. And Sasha, Dean's adopted daughter from his brief third marriage, received the smallest share of all. A trust with specific conditions about maintaining the Martin name, about not embarrassing the family or exploiting her connection to Dean for commercial purposes. She was being taken care of, but barely. She was being kept in the family, but at the very edge of it. The attorney kept reading. There were additional provisions. Some of the trusts included requirements to cooperate with estate decisions, to participate in legacy preservation efforts, to support Deana's vision for how their father would be remembered. Dean was, in effect, controlling his family from the grave, rewarding those who'd persisted, punishing those who'd given up, and making absolutely clear who he trusted to carry his name forward. Craig Martin, Dean's eldest son, sat through the entire reading without expression. When it was over, when the attorney asked if anyone had questions, Craig stood up and walked out. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The will had answered everything. His father had been keeping score all along, measuring each relationship, each visit, each phone call or lack thereof. And Craig had been found wanting. Claudia, sitting beside her husband, began crying quietly. Not tears of grief anymore. Those had been shed at the funeral. These were tears of something more complicated. Confirmation, perhaps, or vindication of a terrible sort. She'd always known her father loved them differently. Now she had proof, written in trust documents and distribution percentages. Deana, overwhelmed by responsibility and guilt and grief and the dozen other emotions she couldn't name, asked to speak with the attorney privately. She needed to understand what her father expected of her, why he'd chosen her, what he wanted her to do with this power he'd given her over his legacy, and, by extension, over her siblings' connection to it. The meeting ended. The Martin children left separately, in different cars, heading to different homes. They didn't gather for a family meal. They didn't discuss what had just happened. They scattered, as they'd been scattered their entire lives. Only now, the division was formalized, official, permanent. Dean Martin's fortune hadn't brought his family together. It had exposed exactly how far apart they'd always been. And it had given them a paper trail, a legal document they could reference for the rest of their lives, proving that their father had measured their worth and found them unequal. Chapter 5. The battle for a legacy. The money could be divided. The houses could be sold, the investments liquidated, the trust funds distributed according to Dean Martin's explicit instructions. But there was something that couldn't be divided so cleanly. His legacy. His name, his image, his story. Who got to control how Dean Martin would be remembered? Who decided which deals to approve and which to reject? Who spoke for him now that he couldn't speak for himself? Dean had given that power to Deana, and it created a rift that would never fully heal. Deana threw herself into the work with an intensity that worried some and inspired others. Within a year of her father's death, she began performing his songs in concert, touring with a full orchestra, and recreating the Dean Martin experience for audiences who missed him. She published a memoir, Memories Are Made of This, Dean Martin Through His Daughter's Eyes, that presented an intimate, loving portrait of a father she'd fought so hard to know. She organized the annual Dean Martin Festival in his hometown of Steubenville, Ohio, turning it into a celebration that drew thousands of fans and raised money for scholarships in her father's name. To many, Deana was doing exactly what a devoted daughter should do, preserving her father's memory, keeping his music alive, ensuring that new generations would discover Dean Martin. But to some of her siblings, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like ownership, like she was turning their father into a brand, a business, a product to be marketed and sold, and they had no say in any of it. Craig, Dean's eldest son, rarely attended the official Martin family events that Deana organized. He gave interviews occasionally, but he declined most requests, and he made his feelings known to anyone who asked. His father had been a complicated man, loving and distant, generous and unavailable, talented and troubled. Craig felt that Deana's version of Dean Martin, the warm, misunderstood family man, was incomplete at best and dishonest at worst. But when he tried to share his own memories, his own truth, he was told it didn't fit the narrative. It didn't match the brand. The conflicts weren't just philosophical. They were practical, painful, and personal. Dean's stage costumes, his microphones, his awards, and memorabilia, all of it was technically part of the estate, but Deana controlled access. She used some of it for her performances, preserving it and sharing it with audiences. But some siblings wanted specific items: a watch, a ring, a personal letter. And when those requests were denied or delayed, it felt like Deana was hoarding their father's memory along with his possessions. There were fights over licensing deals. In 2023, Deana negotiated a major partnership with Iconic Artists Group, a company specializing in legacy management for deceased entertainers. The deal gave them rights to Dean Martin's name and likeness for merchandise, potential hologram performances, streaming content, and more. It was worth millions and would generate ongoing revenue for the estate. Deana consulted with the other heirs as required by the trust documents, but ultimately the decision was hers. Some siblings supported it, others felt it was exploitation. But their opinions didn't matter. Dean had made sure of that when he structured the will. The holidays became the most visible evidence of the family's fracture. The first Christmas after Dean's death in 1996, all 8 children gathered. An awkward, painful reunion, but they were together. By 2000, there were 2 separate gatherings. One organized by Deana with Richie and Gina in attendance, another quietly held by Craig with Claudia and Gail. Sasha floated between both, never quite belonging to either group. By 2010, there were 3 or 4 Martin family Christmases, depending on who you asked, scattered across California and beyond, each celebrating the same father, but remembering him differently. At the 2015 Dean Martin Festival in Steubenville, Deana performed to a sold-out crowd. She sang "That's Amore" and "Everybody Loves Somebody," and the audience sang along, waving and celebrating. In the back of the theater sat Craig, who had made a rare appearance. When the MC invited family members to join Deana on stage for the finale, Craig stayed in his seat. Later, a family friend asked why he didn't participate. Craig's answer was simple and devastating. "That's not how I remember my father, and I won't pretend it is, even if it makes people uncomfortable." The fortune had been divided according to Dean Martin's wishes. The legacy, however, would remain contested forever. A battle between those who wanted to preserve a perfect image and those who wanted to tell the complicated truth. Dean had chosen his champion, but he'd also ensured that the fight would never really end. Chapter 6. Why Dean Divided Them. The Truth from the Grave. 25 years after Dean Martin's death, the attorney who'd worked with him during his final years finally retired. In his last interview before closing his practice, he revealed something that none of the Martin children had fully understood, something that changed the entire story. Dean Martin knew exactly what he was doing when he divided his fortune unequally. He understood it would create conflict, And in a devastating way, he wanted it that way. The attorney explained that Dean met with him regularly during those isolated years after Dino Jr.'s death. They'd work on the estate plan for hours, reviewing every distribution, every trust provision, every detail. And Dean kept detailed notes explaining his reasoning for each decision. Not legal notes, personal ones. Journals that revealed his thinking, his regrets, and his brutal honesty about each of his children. About Deana, Dean wrote extensively.
She was the one who'd never given up on him, even when he gave her every reason to. She'd call when he didn't answer. She'd visit when he turned everyone away. She'd sit in his living room watching old westerns with him, not trying to fix him or change him, just being there. Dean wrote that she'd earned the right to control his legacy because she'd fought for a relationship with him when fighting seemed pointless. He trusted her to work hard, maybe too hard, to preserve his memory. He knew she'd sacrifice her own life to maintain his, and he believed that dedication deserved to be rewarded with power. About his first 3 children from Betty, Craig, Claudia, and Gail, Dean's notes were more complicated. He acknowledged that he'd failed them first. He'd left them when they were young, traded their childhoods for fame and success, and never really tried to repair what he'd broken. He wrote that they'd become strong, independent adults precisely because he hadn't been there, because they'd learned they couldn't rely on him. And because of that, he believed they didn't need his money the way others might. They'd proven they could survive without him. The smaller inheritances weren't punishment in his mind. They were acknowledgement that he couldn't buy back what he'd never given them. The trust funds couldn't replace fatherhood, so why pretend they could? About Richie and Gina, his children with Jean, Dean wrote with a different kind of sadness. They'd had his golden years, the fame, the wealth, the Beverly Hills lifestyle, but they'd also had his dysfunction, his drinking, his absences, his emotional walls. They'd grown up comfortable but distant, wealthy but lonely. He wanted them secure for life, but he didn't want them dependent. He didn't want them to need him after death the way they'd needed him in life, only to find him unavailable then too. About Sasha, his adopted daughter from the brief third marriage, Dean was perhaps most honest. He wrote that she deserved a place in the family because he'd legally made her a Martin, and he wouldn't go back on that. But he also acknowledged they'd barely known each other. She was part of his family on paper, but not in heart, and the smaller inheritance reflected that uncomfortable truth. He didn't want her burdened by expectations or forced into family dynamics that had never really included her. The limited trust gave her financial security without demanding emotional performance. The attorney revealed one more thing, perhaps the most devastating detail of all. Dean Paul's death hadn't just broken Dean's heart. It had clarified something he'd been avoiding his entire life. He'd always known he loved his children differently. Every parent does, though few admit it. But Dino Jr.'s death forced Dean to confront that truth directly. He'd lost his favorite, and the grief was different because the love had been different. In his notes, Dean wrote that trying to pretend he loved all his children equally would be a lie, one final performance in a life built on performance. So instead, he decided to be honest. The will would tell the truth he'd never been able to speak while alive. The fortune was divided unequally because the relationships had been unequal. Some of his children had earned more through persistence and forgiveness. Some had earned less through distance and self-protection. And Dean Martin, brutal in his self-awareness during those final years, structured his estate to reflect that reality. He wasn't trying to be fair. He was trying to be honest. And honesty, as his children discovered, can be more devastating than any amount of injustice. Chapter 7. What Remains. A Divided Family and an Honest Legacy. Today, nearly 3 decades after Dean Martin's death, his fortune continues to grow. Streaming platforms have introduced his music to new generations who never saw him perform live. His television show airs in syndication worldwide. The merchandising deals continue. The licensing agreements generate millions annually. The estate that was worth $30 million in 1995 has likely doubled or tripled in value. Dean Martin is more profitable dead than he was in his final living years. But his family remains divided, separated by the very wealth that was supposed to secure them. Deana continues her tireless work preserving her father's legacy. She tours internationally, performing his songs for audiences who never knew him. She oversees the licensing deals, approves the merchandise, and maintains control over how Dean Martin is presented to the world. She has dedicated her life to her father's memory, and whether that's beautiful devotion or tragic obsession depends on who's telling the story. Craig, Claudia, and Gail live quieter lives, mostly away from the spotlight their father inhabited. They appear occasionally at family events, more out of obligation than desire. Their relationships with Deana range from cordial to non-existent, depending on the year and the circumstances. They have the money Dean left them, and they've moved on with their lives in ways that suggest they made peace with their father's absence long before his death formalized it. Richie and Gina maintain Switzerland-like neutrality, keeping relationships with all sides while committing fully to none. They attend some legacy events, but skip others. They benefit from the Martin Trust, but don't define themselves by it. They found a balance their other siblings couldn't, honoring their father without being consumed by his memory or bitter about his failures. Sasha remains the most peripheral Martin, present at the edges but never at the center. She carries the name but not the burden, which may be exactly what Dean intended for her. The Martin children no longer gather for single-family holidays. There are multiple Christmas celebrations, multiple Thanksgivings, multiple birthday acknowledgments that happen in separate cities with separate guest lists. They are bound by DNA and legal documents, by shared childhood memories and collective inheritance. But they are not, in any meaningful sense, a united family. And perhaps that's the most honest ending to Dean Martin's story. He was a man who loved imperfectly, who built an empire while failing at fatherhood, who gave his children financial security while withholding emotional intimacy. He divided his fortune unequally because he loved unequally. And he was finally honest about it when honesty could no longer be avoided. The will didn't divide his family. It simply revealed and formalized divisions that had existed for decades. Dean Martin left behind a fortune that divided his family forever. But if we're completely honest, they were already divided. The money just made it official. The trust documents just wrote down what everyone already knew, but no one wanted to say out loud. He loved them differently. He planned for them differently. And in the end, they would remember him differently. 8 children, 3 families, one complicated, impossibly flawed man who built an empire and left behind a legacy as fractured as his relationships. That was Dean Martin. Cool to the world, distant to his family, honest in death, even when honesty hurt.